In fact, Jimmy Page once said that he feels or believes that he's a vehicle for another force or a higher force. Robert Plant often said that somebody else is pushing the pen for them. Now, as we look at the following clip, we're going to see some pretty startling things. We're going to see, like the other rock bands we've been looking at, that they have definitely been moved by the teachings of Aleister Crowley and by the Satanism of Aleister Crowley. In fact, they were brought to success by practicing his magic and influencing the world with his ideologies. Let's look at Led Zeppelin.
The mighty Led Zeppelin took off in 1968, and in that very year, their second album would replace the Beatles' Abbey Road at the top of the charts. They would end up becoming the new kings of rock and roll through the decade of the 1970s. Millett and Button state in their book, Led Zeppelin in the Light, if Elvis Presley and Little Richard dominated the 50s, and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones dominated the 60s, Led Zeppelin, the biggest selling rock group the world has ever known, have unarguably dominated the 70s. It is upon the guitar wizardry of Jimmy Page, the leader of Led Zeppelin, who Carlos Santana referred to as the Stravinsky of the Les Paul, that Led Zeppelin was built. Guitar World magazine, in their 2000 Millennium issue, stated that Jimmy Page is as giant a shaper of rock and roll as Chuck Berry, Elvis, and the Beatles. According to Richard Cole, Zeppelin's road manager, the story of Zeppelin selling their souls to Satan for power and fame actually got started with Page himself as he shared with groupies who were interested in his dark side. Cole stated, "It is proclaimed that in the earliest days, the band members, except for John Paul, who refused to participate, had made a secret pact among themselves, selling their souls to the devil in exchange for the band's enormous success. One of our roadies once said to me, I tried to broach the subject once and Jimmy went into a rage. I'd never raise the issue again." Jimmy Page never came out and publicly admitted that he was a Satanist. Abaddon, the founder of the heavy metal group Venom, stated, "If Jimmy Page had gone out and said Led Zeppelin are a satanic band and I'm a Satanist or whatever, it would have flattened Led Zeppelin in the 1970s. Notwithstanding, the evidence of Page's Satanism is quite compelling when one realizes that Page is a disciple of the teachings of Satanist Aleister Crowley, and that Page has practiced his magic and incorporated Crowley's teachings into Led Zeppelin's music. Jimmy Page said, "I feel Crowley's a misunderstood genius of the 20th century because his whole thing was liberation of the person, of the entity, and that restriction would foul you up. A lot of the points he made can be seen to manifest themselves all down the line. His thing was total liberation and really getting down to what part you played. What you want to do, do it." Jimmy Page admitted, "Crowley was like an eye to the world into the forthcoming situation. My studies have been quite intensive. I've employed his system into my own day-to-day life, and that is the way big names are made these days, not via the press or ready, steady, go." Michael Desbarres, once an intimate friend of Jimmy Page's, said, "Jimmy was the classic rock star with the moated castle, the velvet clothes, the fabulous cars that he couldn't drive, and the 80,000 rare guitars. And like an idiot, I was dabbling with the Aleister Crowley thing at the time." He went on to admit, "I used to go down and see Jimmy at Plumpton Place, and he'd pull out Crowley's robes, Crowley's tarot deck, all of Crowley's gear that he collected. I thought, this is great. It was so twisted and debauched, their whole thing. That is what Jimmy represented to me." Jimmy Page's obsession with Aleister Crowley was so great that he even bought Crowley's Boleskine house overlooking Loch Ness. Crowley used Boleskine as a type of satanic headquarters to summon the demons Thoth and Horus. Jimmy Page acknowledged, yes, it was owned by Aleister Crowley. Strange things had happened in that house that had nothing to do with Crowley. The bad vibes were already there. Page declared, of course, after Crowley there have been suicides and people carted off to mental hospitals. Jimmy Page stated, "Many is the time I just stay home alone. I spend a lot of time near water. Crowley's house is in Loch Ness, Scotland. There were 2 or 3 owners before Crowley moved into it. It was also a church that was burned to the ground with a congregation in it." So obsessed is Page with Aleister Crowley and his Satanism that he even opened up his own occult bookstore called the Equinox, named after a publication by Crowley. This bookstore doubled for Jimmy Page as his own personal library. This bookstore ended up being the biggest occult bookstore in London. Jimmy Page said, "There was not one good collection of books on the occult in London, and I was tired of having to go all different places to get the books I wanted." Here we see an advertisement for Jimmy Page's soundtrack that he did for Satanist Kenneth Anger's film promoting Satanism called Lucifer Rising. Kenneth Anger ended up turning down Page's soundtrack, calling it too somber and morbid even for him as a Satanist. As we've seen earlier in this presentation, that he ended up going with Manson family murderer Bobby Beausoleil's instead. On the cover of the CD jacket, we see Jimmy Page, the sorcerer's apprentice, gazing admiringly at Satanist Aleister Crowley. The music you hear in the background is actually from the CD under discussion. In Crowley's book Magic, he describes the setting for the Satanic Temple. Crowley calls for the sorcerer to use a pillar or obelisk with countercharges in black and white. This obelisk represents the power of Satan. Led Zeppelin used an obelisk for the cover of their album Presence. Page said it was suggested that they call the album Obelisk, but that, quote, to me, it was more important what was behind the obelisk. Throughout the artwork of the album, this obelisk is seen in various settings. Here we see a school teacher transferring the power of the presence of Satan behind the obelisk into a student. Led Zeppelin started their own record label called Swan Song. The label depicts the sun god Apollo, the so-called god of music, which takes the appearance of a fallen angel when revolving on a turntable. And what is the meaning of Swan Song? Robert Plant admitted, quote, the name Led Zeppelin means a failure, and Swan Song means a last gasp, so why not name our record label that? The Bible speaks of the fall of Satan, the fallen angel, and associates his fall with deception and music. Crowley also refers to the divine swan in his writings, and he writes, and the wild swan sings, and my heart sings. Satan is aware that he is doomed to eternal punishment, and he seeks to pull as many people down with him as possible. He uses bands like Led Zeppelin to deceive the masses and bring them to hell. On Led Zeppelin's third album, Jimmy Page continued to promote Crowley's Satanism, right down to inscribing Crowley's sayings in the dead wax and the runoff matrix in the center of the album. Here we see Crowley saying for summoning demons to do his bidding, so mote be it. According to Zeppelin biography Hammer of the Gods, quote, Jimmy was casting his spell, end quote. Jimmy Page relied on spells and dark satanic forces to ensure Zeppelin's enormous success. Here we see that Jimmy Page also had Crowley's saying, do what thou wilt, inscribed on the runoff matrix of their third album. Page would later admit that he wanted to put do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, but it wouldn't fit. He said, quote, that was instructed but under a strict cloak of secrecy. Led Zeppelin's album Houses of the Holy sold several million copies, but what was the concept that Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin were promoting behind the album? With several young children climbing up a mountain. Aleister Crowley taught his disciples like Jimmy Page through his book Magic to do several things backwards, including this statement, quote, let him learn to write backwards with either hand. Led Zeppelin did just this with their album Houses of the Holy. Ultimately then, this would not be the houses of the holy, but the houses of the unholy. The concept behind Houses of the Holy appears to be human sacrifice to Satan. Aleister Crowley taught, sacrifice cattle little and big after a child. Mercy, let it be off. Damn them who pity. Kill and torture. Spare not. Be upon them. He said the best blood is that of the fresh blood of a child. The incredibly wicked Aleister Crowley, who himself admitted sacrificing many babies, said this, quote, but the bloody sacrifice, though more dangerous, is more efficacious, and for nearly all purposes human sacrifice is best. He also taught the animal should therefore be killed within the circle. For the highest spiritual working, one must accordingly choose that victim which contains the greatest and purest force. A male child of perfect innocence and high intelligence is the most satisfactory and suitable victim. In Zeppelin's song Houses of the Holy from their Physical Graffiti album, Led Zeppelin tells their fans that they should let the music be their master, and will they heed their master's call? And then they state, Satan and man.